welcome to this section on your summer school on dementia. And in particular, this session is entitled The Brain and Dementia. A big welcome from me and of course everyone here at Dementia UK. My name is Chris and I put a little bit there about who I am. I am an Admiral nurse and a learning disability nurse and a social worker. And I'm currently Associate Professor in Dementia Studies and Cognitive Care here at Montfort University in Leicester. Now, bear with me, guys, while I try and see how I move these slides. Here we go. So to begin with, then, it's quite interesting when we're talking about the brain, because normally when we talk about dementia, we have this really important focus on person-centered care and relationship-centered care, including the great need to foster a psychosocial approach in our working. I think what sometimes gets forgotten by many is the psychosocial approach is one part of or rather two parts of a biopsychosocial approach. And this comes back to some of the earliest work by Kitwood, quite old now, 1993, but we classify it as quite a good classical reference about the starting point of person-centered care. And I'll explain to you what those letters mean, but you'll see I've coloured in yellow, highlighted it, NI. And what I'm trying to do there is highlight the importance that was postulated by Kitwood, that understanding the brain is also important, as well as the social psychological remits as well. So just a little bit about this before we start as well for an introduction and to set the scene really for looking at the brain. Kitwood, writing in the early 1990s, wanted to expand this idea that understanding dementia was more than just the medical model. And he put this idea forward, which is what we use both academically, but also more importantly in practice. So I'm guessing some of you, particularly some of the professionals out there, may have heard of this. Some people may not. So I'll just run through it very quickly. These letters stand for various terms, and together the plus equals someone's potential experience of their individual dementia. It individualizes it. It makes it person-centered. So for Kitwood, these letters meant different things, and I'll just give you a minute if you wanted to pop in a comment box as you see fit what you think those letters may stand for. And when there's two letters, it's two words. So those two words are NI and SP. So I'll just give you a minute. I won't leave you too long writing, but just have a guess. To understand someone's experience of dementia, what do you think those individual factors may be? Okay, I won't leave you too long because it's just a quick thought process. So don't worry if you've not had much time to write anything, but hopefully you've had a little think. So very briefly, P is personality. So different people's personality affects their own individual experience. B is background or biography. So our history, where we've come from, where we're going, our past achievements, our experiences, etc. H becomes health, both physical health and mental health. NI, and that's the important one that we're doing today, neurological impairment. So essentially what's happening in the brain. And finally, SP, and this is the one which Kitwood brought to many people's attention, the importance of social psychology. And all of those together sum up someone's individual experience of their condition, and that individualizes things. So again, a lot of stuff has been made on the SP, which I'm sure most of you will be aware of. And for the purpose of today, we're going to focus particularly on the NI aspect, the neurological impairment. And we're using this to just highlight that the brain is part of being person-centered. You can't discuss, or you can't exclude, I guess, the medical model if you're being person-centered. It is part of it in addition to psychosocial factors too. So I hope that makes sense and sets really the scene of where we're going with things. Right, on the next slide then, if we're going to be discussing neurological impairment, and that just means the brain, I've got a very basic slide which will just highlight a little bit about the brain and what the main parts do. So this slide I've put down in little bits at the bottom where the slide was taken from. This includes, or this shows different lobes of the brain and what they do. And the reason why an understanding of this can be important is depending on what part of the brain has been affected may result in a particular, I guess, presentation of symptomology. Now, sometimes that may help give an idea as to what type of dementia a person may have, something we're going to come up to very soon. Sometimes it will also give an idea as to the progression of dementia. What I want people to think about more specifically is if that part of the brain has been affected, what parts currently have not been affected? And therefore, can we start looking at ability and not just focus on disability? So if we know, for example, the frontal lobe has been affected by the symptoms that we can perceive, but the other areas appear to be relatively unaffected at this stage, let's focus and harness their potential for as long as we can. So this is when we use the medical model to actually support what can be seen as a disability model. Let's focus on the ability that the persons may have and use that to structure and support our care. So we're just going to have a little walk around these lobes of the brain. So right at the front, as one can be expected, is called the frontal lobe. Now, I'm used to teaching at times people who have got no knowledge of the brain whatsoever. So I don't know if you can see, have a look at the camera down there or up there, depending where the camera is, and you'll see me and this cauliflower. Hopefully you can see it all right. What I tend to do with this marker pen is I'm going to draw this line around the front of it. I don't know if that's very clear. Not very clear on a camera, and I put an F. That refers to then the frontal part of the brain, that bit at the front on the screen. Now the frontal part of the brain controls things like motor control, problem solving, speech production. And in a minute we'll do an exercise to examine what else it could control to. But you're just getting an idea. Motor control, problem solving and speech production. We then move to the sides of the brain. So here in this cauliflower, these sides here, the sides of your head, temporal lobe. Now this is a really, really important area for perhaps the most common type of dementia that you may have come across, Alzheimer's disease, because in the temporal lobe, that's where we focus on memory, information retrieval. It also supports language comprehension and auditory processing. We then move on to the top of the head, just behind the frontal and touching on the temporal lobes, the parietal lobe. And that's a really important lobe or part of the brain which looks at body orientation, sensory discrimination and touch. So really sensory focused. Think of it in the same way as when you see and it goes to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, which sits behind it, all those messages go through your eyes back to your optic nerve to your occipital lobe. It then gets transmitted to your parietal lobe for interpretation. So our sensory processing, a lot of it happens in this particular area of the brain. Then at the back, as I've just said, the occipital lobe sits at the back, and that helps take on board all this visual information that we may get. So those are the bits I want you to focus on for now. Now, if you remember what I said about if we know what the brain does and we understand what parts of the brain have gone wrong, we can then focus on what a person can still do, and hopefully we can maximize that as much as possible. So if on this cauliflower someone had a problem with the frontal part of the brain and I removed all those florets, let me try and do that without making a mess on my desk. Here we go. There we are. Florets all over the place, but the frontal lobe is gone. We can still see very clearly we have brain left. And what parts of the brain we have left? Well, we've got temporal, parietal and occipital. So what bits can I use still and maximize as much as possible? And that should be our focus. We recognize these symptoms because these things are going wrong, but rather than overly focusing on that, let's also focus on what the person can still do and see how we can maximize their potential. So there are a number of reasons why understanding the lobes of the brain are important, and how we relate that specifically to dementia, dementia subtypes and dementia progression. So a little exercise now on understanding the frontal lobe, and this links in really to a very important example of probably one of the four most commonest types of dementia. So you may have heard of something called FTLD, frontal temporal lobe degeneration, FTLD. Sometimes it may be referred to as Pick's disease. Now, this dementia, a very interesting one, starts at the frontal lobe. So again, we can look at the picture there, think again about the cauliflower, and we can start to imagine what the frontal lobe controls, and a person with this diagnosis, what could be some of their different behaviours or presentations. We tend to argue, certainly in the clinical picture, that we see people presenting with the behavioural type or sometimes a communication type. And we can see how that may be the case looking at what the frontal lobe does. When I try to explain to people how they can remember that, I use the analogy of getting drunk. And I do this in a kind and sympathetic way, but not to say that frontal of FTLD has anything to do with alcohol. I'm only using it to remind people that when you do drink alcohol, the first part of the brain or the first part of the body to be affected is the frontal lobe. And that's why people behave in a certain way. So if you want to know what the frontal lobe controls, imagine what people do when they're drunk, because that's the frontal lobe being triggered. So that will give you an idea of what the frontal lobe does. So I just want to clarify, this has nothing to do with alcohol. All I'm trying to suggest is if you understand what's happening here, it does help you remember what some of the symptoms or presentations might be. So I'm just going to ask you if you feel happy to do so, and I realise for some people you may not drink, so you may not know, but in the comments box or similar, what might be some of the behaviours or presentations people do when they're drunk? And then we can start to think how that may relate to some of the symptoms you get in frontal temporal lobe degeneration. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. As you're writing, I'll probably keep talking, so do forgive me. It's a pity I can't be there with you on the day to go through your comments, but I'm sure you've got some fantastic presenters and facilitators there to do that. But usually we have a whole array of different thoughts, and some people can spend quite a long time having a big discussion about what happens when they're drunk. But what I'm guessing we will start to see are things like risk-taking behaviour. Sometimes people being overconfident. Sometimes people making what could be perceived as unwise decisions. Sometimes in the very rare examples, so this isn't everyone with FTLD, but some rare examples, you may get sexual disinhibition. Again, when people are drunk and drink too much alcohol, you may get that too. They may crave certain types of foods like people do when they're drunk. There may be some degree of personality change. And that's often one of those cardinal symptoms. They're a different type of person, personality-wise, than what they were before. Again, not all cases, but some. So we're starting to have a picture of what frontal temporal lobe degeneration may look like, and some of its complications if we're having those behaviours. What's really important to consider is, I've not yet said memory. And that's a really important point. Dementia is not all about memory loss. If you have frontal temporal lobe degeneration, you do not start with memory loss. You start with potentially some of these behavioural or communication challenges. So again, let's look back what the frontal lobe does on the slide. Motor control, problem solving, speech production, and then think as well, what happens when people may be drunk? What type of behaviours might you see? The overconfidence of risk taking, the personality change. When people get drunk, they become really loud or really quiet, etc. And that may be, for some people, again, not everyone, part of the presentation. And again, I want to say that with kindness. When we're talking about some of the presentations and symptoms, let's be aware again that this is all very individualized. And just because I say symptoms, I don't want anyone to presume everyone with that type of dementia will present in that way, because of course they won't. People are very different. This is just to give you an overview, so you're aware. Okay, so I think frontal temporal lobe degeneration is a useful example of why understanding the brain is actually quite important. It presents us with a different aspect of dementia that perhaps many of us weren't used to. Now, it's called frontal temporal lobe for a reason. Temporal lobe is next to it, or rather just behind it. So as FTLD progresses from frontal, it does go temporal, and then you do get memory loss. But that happens quite later on as the dementia progresses. So it's not the first symptom, but you will get it later on, but not straight away. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm hoping if I just jump forward to give you that focus, we're going on to the brain and dementia, and that's part of person-centered care because that includes understanding the bio as part of a psychosocial and this neurological impairment as advocated by the marvelous Tom Kitwood many years ago. And we now start to think about, well, what does the brain do? And a great example is frontal lobe and how we can see we may have a particular type of presentation. So I hope that leads us almost seamlessly to this question. What is dementia? Now, dementia is a funny old thing. It's Latin, dementia, and that's where we get it from. I think the term was, people say the term was coined by Pinel, etc., but actually it first came as a term in a French medical encyclopedia. I forget the date. I think it was 1746 or around that time. Anyway, it was a long time ago. But de means loss and mentia means mind. So it's a category of conditions that lead to a loss of mind, which is a really important consideration. Because to lose something means you should have had it. So there has to be a period of time where some degree of understanding, executive functioning, comprehension, memory, all sorts of things happening in the head, those were gained. And then as time went on, they were lost, a dementia. Now, there are, of course, many conditions that can cause a loss of mind. And I think later on you'll be having some talks about delirium, for example, which can cause that. In dementia, it's a progressive loss of mind. So it continues and continues and continues and gets worse and worse and worse. There's a continual deterioration. Okay, so that's what the term itself means, and it's an umbrella term. Again, some of you may know this answer, so I'll give you a few minutes. This is quite interesting to do because I can't see what you're writing because I'm telling you this before the event, as it were. But I'm sure the facilitators will have fun looking at this. Could you, as participants, in the comments box, just type in how many different forms or types of dementia you think they are? And you know at least one, because I've mentioned it a slide ago, frontal temporal lobe degeneration. That's one. What else have you heard of? And don't worry about spelling and don't worry about terms for now. Just write down a number. How many different types or forms of dementia do you think there may be? So I'm just going to give you a few minutes, probably a few seconds actually, but a short period of time for you to write down a number just there. Take a wild guess. Don't Google, just take a wild guess. Okay, I'm going to have a guess that you've guessed. If anyone said 4, it's a bit more than that. Although there are 4 common ones that we see in the UK. So I understand why people do say 4, but it's a lot more than that. The actual answer is over 200. So in a session like this, we certainly can't, and I won't know all 200, but we need to know there's over 200 different types of dementia. Many years ago, at my last count, I tried to write them all down and I came up with 257. But it's quite difficult, isn't it, to understand, is this the same term? Is this a different term used for the same dementia but used by different people. So we can safely say there are over 200 different forms or types. And I do know as part of this summer school, you do look at a couple of these in a bit more detail, which is lovely. I know you'll have a lovely talk, those of you going to the marvellous Rachel Thompson's talk on dementia with Lewy bodies, for example. So, umbrella term, many forms of types. So that leads me to the next 4 in your comments box. Can anyone name any of the 200? So frontal temporal lobe is 1. You're welcome to just put FTLD. That's great. And of course, I've just mentioned dementia with Lewy bodies, or the Lewy body dementias. So that's 2. Any more? And it'd be interesting if I can't say the word facilitators get to see all 200 or all 256 in the box. So I'll give you a few moments again. And please do not worry about spelling. The facilitators aren't doing spell checks. We're just going to see what the knowledge really is in the room, as it were. So I'll give you a few minutes. So what do you think are the names of some of these different forms or types of dementia? And that's something you may want to pick up on later on at the very end, because you may have put something in the comments box and you think, oh, I'm not sure, is this dementia, is this not? Then hold on to that, because then at the very end, when you're in the summer school, your facilitators may be then to raise some of those with you and help identify some of the things you put down as to whether that's a dementia or whether we class it as something quite different. Okay. What I will show you is some of the more common types. Here we go. And then the next slide, some of the more rare types. But we'll do some of the more common types first. So just take a look at these 4 and give yourself a good pat on the back if these are some of the ones that you identified. The letters in brackets just refer to sometimes the abbreviations that you may see or that we may use in clinical practice. So the first one, the most common type of dementia, is Alzheimer's disease. Now, interestingly, a long time ago, when I say a long time ago, I mean when I was a student nurse, and that was, well, I'm 50 now. Well, I was 50 last week, so I'm 50 in a week. I was told something about Alzheimer's disease, which was part of our training, which we now know to be incorrect. And that's an important part of keeping up to date, I guess. We were taught that Alzheimer's disease is a term we use for young onset. And I need to say that's absolutely incorrect. And again, you're going to have a marvellous talk later on about young onset dementia, and you'll realise it's not all about Alzheimer's. But that was a fallacy which was spoken about in the 80s. So we need to move away from that. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, and actually, as we age, the risk increases. So the more older you get, then the greater increase or prevalence we have of Alzheimer's disease. Without getting too technical and too wordy about it, we have things called amyloid proteins, which appear in the temporal lobe of the brain. Remember on that slide, the bits on the side that control memory? That's where these amyloid proteins start to build up, plaques and tangles, etc. And they sit in a particular thing. I don't know, I'm going to see if I can draw this on this slide. This may work, it may not work. Let's have a look. Okay, I've got a red pen here. Now, I don't know if you can see what I'm trying to draw with the mouse, so bear with me. Feel free to write in the comments box what you think I'm drawing here. I'm guessing, but if anyone's wrote monkey, it's not a monkey. I'm not the best drawer. Nor is it a cow. This is meant to be a hippo. And the hippo is, and this is a wigwam or a tent. I still call them wigwams. There we go. The hippo is camping. So there's a part in the brain called the hippocampus. Now let me see if I can erase those slides. There we go. Eraser. Brilliant. So a part of the brain in the temporal lobe, a small part is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what we use to control memory. So imagine you're sending information to your hippo and it's deciding whether to keep it, short-term memory, on the desk, or whether to file it in its long-term filing cabinet. Now, as we get more tangles and plaques building up around the hippo, it can't do its job as well, and therefore the short-term memory collapses. You give it new information, it doesn't know where to put it. So short-term memory starts to get lost. So to make sense of the world, it resorts to information that's stored already in this filing cabinet of memories, the long-term memories. And that's why for many people with Alzheimer's disease, as it progresses, short-term memory is lost, but yet long-term memory can get preserved. So they may have a lot of understanding, memory, being able to recite and remember things from the past. And yet what happened not so long ago, sometimes just a few minutes ago, they can't remember at all. And that's because the short-term memory no longer works. It's not their fault. The hippocampus is no longer working. So it's relying on previously stored memories in its long-term filing cabinet. And over time, those memories itself get a bit jumbled up and shuffled around. So sometimes they get a little bit out of order, but that becomes a store of understanding. And the way memories work, usually in terms of memory retrieval, is they're governed quite a bit by emotions. So if you start to reminisce or think yourself about some memories that you keep to heart, the memories you tend to have are ones that are often triggered by an emotion. And that can be a really sad emotion, an angry one, a happy one, etc. And it's really interesting how emotions can help us remember or trigger important thoughts. Now, emotions sit with us for a long, long time, which is great. And this is an important bit of our understanding. If someone has got short-term memory loss and they ask you a question and you answer it, they ask you again and you answer it, they ask you again and you answer it, and after a time you may feel a bit worn out or cross because you keep answering the same question over and over again. Now, they've got no recollection you've said anything to them, so to them, each time they ask you, it's the first time they're asking you. But I appreciate how wearing that can be for some people. Now, if you react to them in a difficult way, they may forget that you've told them an answer, but what they may well remember is the emotion that you displayed when you were speaking to them. So there's an issue about short-term memory loss, and they'll forget. They may forget some of the factual knowledge, some of the that part of the memory, but they may not. They may still remember some of the emotion or how they felt at the time you were communicating a message to them, and that's a really important thing to think about. Our remembering of emotions may be very clear, and it's not always the same as how we remember facts. So someone can be very cross with, they don't know why, but when you walk in, they're like, oh, no, I'm not very happy. I don't want to go there. I don't like that person, but I don't know why. It's because they remembered something about the emotional dialogue that was presented to them. The person was angry or frustrated or anxious about what the person was doing, and that's what they remember. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease, we often talk about it in terms of short-term memory loss. We can also talk about it in terms of disorientation and getting lost and confusing directions. Now, that can be normal as well. Short-term memory loss and getting lost. I think you can argue we all experience that at some point in our time. How do we know it becomes dementia? And that's when we start to think about the effect it has, a lifelong effect on our ability to live independently. And I tend to use the example of you go to a well-known supermarket. There are many all over the place. I bought the cauliflower from one of them earlier. And you go to a supermarket and you forget what you've bought. Oh, no, you don't forget what you bought. You forget what you're going to buy. You can't remember. Now, that's not dementia. But if you are in a supermarket and you forget what you're going to buy, you forget how you got there, you forget who you're with, you forget, why am I in a supermarket? Where am I now? Then that becomes more of a worrying sign for many people. So memory loss itself isn't a sign, but as it starts to affect and has a prolonged effect on our activities of daily living, then that's something we need to have be a bit more sensitive to. Now, the progression of Alzheimer's disease, it starts in the hippocampus, in the temporal lobe of the brain, and will gradually spread to other areas. And it's a gradual, when I say a gradual decline, this is talking in a very medically orientated way, but gradually more parts of the brain become affected. And that's why, and that's why I want to stress. So I've got my cauliflower here. That's what I want to stress. If it's affecting the temporal lobes, let's please look at the other lobes. What do the other lobes do? Let's help those to function as much as possible. If the temporal lobe or your hippo is finding things difficult, let's look at what other things you've got in your brain and let's utilize that as much as possible. Let's support this biomedical awareness with a disability model to do a let's see what I can do. Let's maximize people's potential while they've still got it. I once had a student nurse way back many years ago when I was on supporting students on placement, and they said to me, Chris, I'm not sure why we're doing this, because isn't it logical to suggest that by tomorrow or by next week they could have forgotten? And they generally believed that was an appropriate rationale for not doing anything in terms of cognitive stimulation. And my answer to them was quite clear. The fact that someone may forget or be unable to do this tomorrow or next week actually makes doing it today even more important. And that's one of the things I want you to think about. To focus on the now. While people can, do what you can while you can. To focus on the now. And again, sometimes that gets forgotten. The next form of dementia we have there is vascular dementia. And we often think about that as a form of dementia that's affected by strokes. But really, it's any form of blood circulation problem, so the brain cells die off. And stroke perhaps is the most common one we can think of. And some people describe this in different ways. Single infarct, multi-infarct, subcortical. All these describe different types and numbers of strokes that can affect how the brain functions. Now, the symptoms you may get presented with actually depend on where we had these. We call them cerebral infarctions. So cerebral meaning brain, infarctions is where there's this lack of blood supply to certain areas. So depending where you had your cerebral infarct may dictate some of the experiences or symptoms that you may see. Again, going back to the importance of understanding the brain and the lobes and what they do, so you can focus on what people can do. Interestingly, when it comes to vascular dementia, we tend to see progression in a stepwise process. So I'll try and find my pen again. There we go. So there we are. I've drawn a line, and then that's the level of cognition. Then there's let's say a stroke as one example, and then the cognition drops. And then we call it plateau again for a while, and then the person may have another stroke. And let's say this is a small stroke, so it drops just a little. And then they plateau, then it drops down again. So we can see what happens is this deterioration occurs when people have more ischemic damage. So a big argument here is a good point of care should be how do we reduce the risk of further strokes? How do we reduce the risk of further cerebral infarctions in the brain? And this goes back to the old adage, healthy heart equals healthy mind. So, for example, in a care home facility, if you had people with vascular dementia, I'd be quite keen to think about how are you monitoring diet, how are you monitoring exercise, how are you monitoring healthy living? Are you doing what you can to ensure they participate and they can be involved, but look at healthy eating. Are you looking at smoking cessation? Where appropriate to do so, because people still need to enjoy their life. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and I fully endorse that. What are you doing to reduce people's levels of stress? What are you doing to reduce people's blood pressure? So that becomes a real key aspect of care planning for dementia if people have got vascular dementia. And if people forget to do that, there's a risk that as more strokes go on, deterioration increases. So there's an opportunity here to slow down the progression by slowing down the risk of further cerebral infarcts, and that should be a real key care planning activity, I would suggest. Okay, I'll try and erase that. There we go. Lovely. So the next one we've got on our list is dementia with Lewy bodies. And I'm not going to say an awful lot about this because we've got the marvellous Rachel Thompson talking about this, I think later on today, but definitely later on in this summer camp. But for those of you who can't make that particular session, very briefly, this form of dementia can present itself in a very abstract way. And by abstract, it may not always be logical. Because someone may present as being cognitively aware and proficient at one period of time, and then either later on that day or a few weeks later present as a not so able, and then back able again. So cognitive fluctuations, that can be quite common. Alongside that, we may see people experiencing sleep disturbances. People may have repeated falls. People may also experience quite florid hallucinations or delusions. And what's interesting is that the literature, and certainly my clinical experience, some of the hallucinations have involved children and animals, but they can be anything. And with that comes this accompanied frustration and anxiety, as you can, I'm sure, be aware that if you're experiencing those and you didn't understand why, the anxiety can be quite high and frustrating for the person. And we find particularly that these disturbances may occur, particularly at night, going alongside the sleep disturbances. We do very much guard against how we're going to manage people's hallucinations. And again, more from Rachel later on. But we do say is a very key standing point, where possible, avoid antipsychotic medication, because that can have a very negative impact on the person with dementia, because it interacts with the Lewy bodies in such a way where it potentially the side effects can be more manifold. So where possible, we tend to avoid antipsychotics to manage the hallucinations. Okay, next one down, frontal temporal lobe. And we've had a little chat about that already, haven't we? And how that does not present with memory loss. It presents more behaviourally or communication focused. And then underneath that, I put other. So over 200 other different types. So again, this is a time when I'll get the facilitators to just check your comments to see, apart from the ones shown there, what other ones may have come up on your list. And I'm wondering if some of those appear on this next slide. There we go. So there are many more, like I said, 256 my last count, but over 200. And here are some of them. Again, I don't expect you to know any of these, but I'm just emphasising the point that dementia is not itself a thing. There are many different types that come under this umbrella term. I guess a couple to pick out. Niemann-Pick disease type C. I couldn't say it then, I'm sorry. That's an example of dementias that may come under, not just under early onset or young onset, but actually under juvenile dementias. Some of the dementias that tend to affect children. So dementia can affect people at any age, including children, as well as early onset, working age to older age. Right at the very bottom, I've put something else I want you to think about, Korsakoff dementia. Now, Korsakoff dementia, people tend to talk about it as alcohol related. And I do understand why, because in our Western society, alcohol related is perhaps the reason we may talk of. But that's because of how our society works. It is not actually caused by alcohol. It's only indirectly caused by alcohol. So again, in the comments box, can anyone take a wild guess as to what you think the cause of Korsakoff dementia might be? If I'm telling you it's not alcohol, that's just a secondary cause. I'll give you a minute. If you're right, Wernicke's encephalopathy, Good luck with spelling it. And yes, that can cause Korsakoff. So what causes Wernicke's? So let's get down to its fundamental base element, as it were. Okay, just a few more seconds for you to type something there as you see fit. Right, I shall tell you the answer, shall I? So good luck to those of you who gave it a go. It's thymine, vitamin B1. It's a thymine deficiency dementia. And the reason why in our Western society we talk about it as alcohol related is because people who consume large amounts of alcohol over a long period of time are more likely to have a thymine deficiency. And that thymine deficiency causes a condition called Wernicke's encephalopathy, which then, if left untreated, will develop into a Korsakoff dementia. So you can see why people associate it with alcohol. But if we're going to be absolutely fair, we need to refer to it as a thymine deficiency dementia, because apart from alcohol, there are other ways we can be thymine deficient, and it's important we understand that variety. The way alcohol and thymine interact and why they come together is quite complex, and there are many different theories for it, which I'm not going to go into today. I just want to highlight that it's not an alcohol dementia as per se, it's a thymine deficiency dementia, which is brought on by alcohol in our society. So I hope you're okay with those different types. Carew is an interesting one, a bit like CJD disease dementia. Carew is caused by a prion protein, and an interesting fact, although a very sad fact, of course, for the people and their families affected, is Carew is actually a form of dementia caused by cannibalism, which we don't see much of here. But it's the same prion protein type progression we may see in CJD dementia, which some of you may remember as being related to BSC, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, a terrible term. But back in the, was it early 90s, I think, mad cow disease. And then we as humans, we then came into contact with the affected cow products by eating or blood transfuse, or by eating it, or then someone else having ate the cow and then giving blood, etc., which had led to CJD. It's this prion protein virus being transmitted. And I think in Carew, the same thing happened, but not through cows, through eating each other. Okay, so those are some of the rarer types, which we may not see much of. I like to mention them because if you do have a rarer type of dementia, it must be really uncomfortable that people never talk about your particular type, and your voice needs to be heard as much as everybody else's. I mean, we can't talk about every one of them, but I think at the very least we can give a nod that there are rarer types out there, and we must be supportive for everybody, not just the main forms and types that we see mostly. So moving forward, I've got this NCD, and the whole point of NCD, it's a new term. I want to say no, it's not really that new. It came out in 2013, but actually it's a new term that we are encouraged to be using to replace the word dementia. And because there's a talk about brain and dementia, I would like to know a little bit as we progress your thoughts as we discuss it. NCD refers to a neurocognitive disorder. And what it actually does then, by calling it this, is it refocuses, it's a refocus on the brain and dementia, and it changes our terminology. As we change the way we talk about something, we automatically change its concept. So term versus concept. If a concept of dementia is something neurocognitive, what we stop doing, and correctly so, is placing it in the area of mental illness. It is not a mental illness. It's a neurodegenerative condition, and it's neurocognitive as a disorder. It is not a mental illness. And I think that's what's really special about DSM. If you look in the bottom corner, you will see where I am in my hat. I've got this book here. I don't know how clear that is because I've blurred the screen. It's a diagnostic statistical manual, DSM-5. I'm sorry if it comes in and out of shot. But we have as clinicians DSM and ICD, two classification systems which are often used to diagnose. And it's really nice that this one is starting to say, can we use the term NCD instead of dementia? You, of course, will have your own thoughts. I've met many wonderful clinicians and academics and people living with dementia who love the term and other people who don't like the term. I think the point of today is to let you know it exists. Your own feelings and thoughts are your own, but at least you know it's a term being used out there. My personal my own personal point about what I like about it is it refocuses our attention away from mental illness and puts it back into the brain, particularly about the cognitive aspect, which helps us remember that dementia is a neurocognitive condition. And therefore, if you are, for example, in a care home, if people say this is a dementia specialist care home, super. Where's your neurocognitive care plan then? That's a really important bit to think about. Let's go back to the brain. If the brain is saying these bits aren't working very well, but these bits are, it's all neurocognitive. So where's your care plan that's helping me manage, support, develop, enhance the bits I can do at that neurocognitive level? Because to me, that is a dementia care plan because it's a neurocognitive disorder. So it does help you think about things in a slightly different way, which is something I find very interesting. So as we progress in this neurocognitive talk, NCD for short, do drop your points in a comments box, which the facilitators may want to pick up later on. So if it's neurocognitive, what do we mean by cognitive? Give me some more detail. So lots of words on here, and I'm sure the slides will be available to you to pick out at some point. But here are just some very brief examples of what we're looking at. And the important bit I want you to think about is cast your eyes over that list of the cognitive domains and look to see where you see memory. Because for some people who are quite new to the field of dementia, they think of dementia and short-term memory loss. Have a look. Where does memory appear on those slides? I'm trying to highlight it, so bear with me as I move my pen backwards and forwards. There we go. I've highlighted some stuff where memory is showing. Can you see it's just one aspect of the cognitive domains? We've got complex attention, sustained attention, divided attention, selective attention, information proceeding speed, executive functioning, planning, decision making, responding to feedback. Oh, we've got another memory there. Working memory, inhibition, mental flexibility, language, naming objects, word finding, fluency, receptive language, perceptual motor function, visual perception, social cognition, including recognition of emotions, theory of mind and insight. Now, these are things that we need to be focusing on a lot more. And I think by calling dementia a neurocognitive disorder, it helps us think about how we can support people with these aspects. It's not just about supporting people with their memory. And again, going back to the brain and that picture that we looked at before, depending on what part of the brain has been affected, will help us understand which parts are probably more affected than others. So we can understand a bit more about their experience and do something about it. So what the classification system tends to do, DSM-5, if we're not going to use the term dementia, how we're going to call it, and it divides it into major or mild. And here are some of the ones it indicates. So we still have Alzheimer's disease, but rather than saying Alzheimer's disease dementia, we say major or mild neurocognitive disorder due to Alzheimer's disease. And Lewy bodies, that you can have a talk later on, rather than just saying Lewy body dementia, major or mild neurocognitive disorder with Lewy bodies. And you can see from the list there, the range of different ones. And we've got the prion disease there. I'll just highlight it. The one that we sometimes see with CJD as one example. So there's quite a list there. Doesn't cover all of them, but we've got other disorders, etc., because the list would be quite expansive if it did try to do that. So again, just facilitating your awareness about neurocognitive disorder and how it relates to the brain, how it relates to actually an ability model, how it deflects away from a mental illness model, and how that makes you think a bit more about the need to understand the brain in a bit more detail. Which then leads us to our very last slide, called Final Thoughts. So, what do you think of the term NCD, neurocognitive disorder? Does it support a better understanding of the brain and its relation to dementia? And what myths might the term NCD start to dispel in relation to dementia? So we've touched on those a little bit, but those are some of the things you may want to bring up later on if you have the opportunity. Okay, so I'll leave it there, but I'm hoping after our short talk, and I'm sorry it was quite short and the cauliflower got destroyed a little bit, but hopefully you know a little bit more about the importance of looking at the brain and how having this biomedical understanding is part of person-centered care. It's an adjunct and it collaborates with psychosocial care to look at person-centeredness. You can't be person-centered without considering the brain. That understanding what goes wrong, it's also important to know what's still preserved, what's still working well, so we can focus on a disability and ability model. That there are different forms and types, over 200, and different forms and types may present in different ways that may suggest why we see certain patterns of behaviour and may reflect what we're doing in our care planning or in our support procedures. And that we're aware that I still call it a new term because we don't use it a lot, but there's this great advocation for this new term, neurocognitive disorder. You can still use the term dementia. What they're saying is, let's see if we can start to use it. So there's no set rules yet. It's just an indication of where we're going, of neurocognitive disorder, which can have its positives as well as perhaps its faults. You may not understand what NCD actually means, and therefore you may get a bit lost in the diagnosis, whereas dementia becomes a familiar word to some people. Whereas for others, it's really useful because it says a lot more about what's happening, and it actually ensures people when they're writing care plans providing support, let's say in a dementia specialist care home, that they're focusing on a neurocognitive need and therefore care planning in a neurocognitive way to support what people can do better. Okay, so that's it. I hope those points are useful for you, and I hope you have a very enjoyable summer school. Take care and thank you very much for listening.